Let me ask you something, right? If Microsoft opened the AZ-900 exam in front of you right now, would you actually pass? Not after another course, not after another revision session, but right now, this second. Because here's the truth about the AZ-900. Most people don't fail because Azure's too difficult, right? They fail because they study it the wrong way. Try to memorize every Azure service, right? They go too deep into technical configuration. Spend hours learning details that Microsoft simply isn't testing at the fundamental level. But the AZ-900 is not about becoming the Azure engineer. It's not understanding the cloud, recognizing core Azure services, and choosing the right answer when Microsoft gives you a business scenario. That's what this Cram session is designed to help you do. In this video, which is video 3 in this Cram session, it's a final video as well, I'm going to focus on concepts that matter the most, like I have in the other videos, right? I'm going to break down the exam the way Microsoft actually wants you to think about it. I'll cover cloud. I've already covered cloud concepts, I've covered service models, I've started covering architecture as well in Azure, compute, network storage, we did identity as well, security. This is more about governance. We're going to talk a little bit about pricing and monitoring as well. And throughout the session, I'm going to give you knowledge check questions as I have done in the previous videos, so we can test as we go along. If you can understand the patterns in this video, you'll be in a much stronger position when you sit the actual exam. So in this final Cram session, we are going to move on to talking about governance and more Azure management services and tools. Now we're actually moving into one of the most important sections of the AZ-900 exam. So we're going to talk about compliance, we'll talk about governance, we'll talk about cost control, monitoring and management tools. And I really want you to pay close attention here because this is actually where a lot of candidates accidentally lose even more marks. Easy marks as well. It's not because the content is difficult, but because the terms actually sound the same, they sound familiar to each other. Things like Azure policy, role-based access control, resource locks, tags, cost management and Azure Advisor as well. Then we have Azure Monitor, Service Health. They all sound like tools that manage Azure, but they actually solve very, very different problems. And the exam loves testing whether you can choose the correct tool for the correct requirement. Microsoft Learn's AZ-900 management and governance learning path is actually structured around 4 areas, right? The first one is estimating, tracking and managing Azure costs. We then have governance and compliance tools. We then have tools for managing and deploying Azure resources. And then we have monitoring tools in Azure. So I want to slow this down and treat it properly, okay? So governance is about control. That's the simplest way to think about it. When an organization starts using Azure, people can start creating resources very quickly. That's one benefit of the cloud, but it can also become a problem, right? A developer might create resources in the wrong region. A project team might forget to apply tags. An administrator might accidentally delete a critical resource. A business unit, they might deploy services that don't meet company standards. At a small scale, these problems might be manageable. However, at enterprise scale, they become serious. Imagine an organization with hundreds of subscriptions, thousands of resource groups, and tens of thousands of Azure resources, right? Without governance, the cloud environment is going to quickly become inconsistent. It's going to become expensive and very, very difficult to secure. That's why governance matters, right? Governance gives organizations a way to apply rules, standards, and guardrails across Azure, right? The first tool you need to understand is Azure policy. I've mentioned this, I think, in the last video. This is one of the most important governance tools in AZ-900. A simple way to explain Azure policy is this. Azure policy helps enforce organizational standards. If the business says resources can only be deployed in an approved region, Azure policy can help enforce that. If the organization says every resource must have a cost center tag, Azure policy can help enforce that. If they want storage accounts only to meet specific configuration requirements, again, Azure policy can really help evaluate and enforce that type of guardrail. Microsoft Learn describes Azure policy in the context of enforcing governance and regulatory compliance. That includes assigning built-in policy definitions and initiatives. It includes creating custom policy definitions as well. Also using those remediation tasks and protecting Azure resources with locks. Now, for the actual AZ-900, you don't need to become an Azure policy engineer, right? You don't even need to write complex policy definitions. You definitely don't need to memorize JSON, right? Or even configure any remediation tasks in the exam. However, what you do need to understand is the purpose, okay? Azure policy is used to enforce rules and assess compliance. That is the exam pattern. If Microsoft gives you a scenario where an organization wants to make sure resources follow a standard, think Azure policy. Let me make it a bit practical for you, okay? A company operates only in Australia and must ensure that resources are not deployed outside approved Australian regions. What should they use? Azure policy. A company requires every Azure resource to include a tag, for maybe department and cost center. What should they use? Azure policy again, right? You can enforce the tagging requirement. While tags themselves, they'll store the metadata. Right, let's do another sort of practical example, right? Company wants to prevent users from deploying resource types that are not approved by the security team. Again, Azure policy. The key exam phrase is enforce. Whenever you see enforce organizational standards, enforce compliance, or restrict locations, these sort of phrases. Phrases like allow only approved configurations, right? Something like audit resources for compliance as well. Azure policy should immediately come to mind. Now, one thing candidates often confuse is Azure policy versus role-based access control, right? They're not the same thing. Role-based access control, or RBAC for short, is about who can do what. Azure policy is about what is allowed. That difference is critical, right? Let's say an administrator has permissions to create virtual machines. That permission is controlled by RBAC, right? But the organization may still want to restrict where those virtual machines can actually be created. That restriction is controlled by Azure policy, right? So RBAC answers the question, who has permission? Azure policy answers the question, is this action or configuration compliant with organizational rules? That's a really important exam distinction. Right, knowledge check time. A company wants to make sure users can only deploy Azure resources in approved regions. Which Azure feature should the company use? Should they use Entra ID, or maybe Azure Policy, or Azure Monitor? How about Azure Service Health? The answer is Azure Policy, right? Why, I hear someone ask? Because the requirement is about enforcing a standard across Azure resources. Now, let's move to resource locks, okay? Resource locks are much simpler than Azure Policy, but they're still going to be in the test, and they're still going to be tested on them, okay? Resource lock helps prevent accidental deletion or modification of Azure services and resources. Quite simple. Microsoft Learn's guided project on tags and locks describe using tags to organize Azure resources and using locks to protect them from accidental deletion. Think about a production database. Someone accidentally deletes it, the business could be in serious trouble, right? Permissions alone may not be enough, because an administrator with the right permissions could still make a mistake. A resource lock adds an extra layer of protection. There are actually two ideas you need to remember, okay? One lock prevents deletion, and another lock type prevents changes. For the AZ-900, you don't need to go too deep into configuration, just remember the purpose, right? Resource locks protect important resources from accidental changes or deletion. This is different from Azure Policy, right? Azure Policy enforces standards. Resource locks protect resources from being changed or deleted. Simple distinction. Let's test it with a knowledge check. An organization has a critical production and storage account. Administrators must be prevented from accidentally deleting it. Which Azure feature should be used? So let's just say your choices are Azure Policy, Resource Lock, Azure Advisor, and Microsoft Cost Management. The answer would be Resource Lock, right? And the key phrase here is prevent accidental deletion. That's what you need to look out for. Now let's talk about tags. Okay, tags are another governance feature, but they solve a different problem. Tags are metadata, right? Think of them as labels. Okay, you can apply tags to Azure resources to make them easier to organize, manage, and report on. A tag might identify the department that owns a resource. Another tag might identify the project. Another might identify the environment, such as production, test, or dev, right? You might have another that identifies a cost center. Tags become especially useful when you need to understand cloud spend. Imagine the finance team asking you, how much did the marketing department spend in Azure last month? If resources are tagged properly, reporting becomes much easier. If resources are not tagged, the answering that question becomes much harder. Microsoft Learn's cost management module includes tags as part of the Azure Cost Management, and its guided project explains how you can apply tags for organization and cost tracking. For the actual exam, tags don't control access, okay? That's an important point. Tags help organize and categorize resources. RBAC controls access. Azure Policy enforces rules. Resource locks prevent accidental deletion or modification. Tags describe resources, right? And if you can remember those distinctions, this section becomes much easier. Let's run another knowledge check, okay? A company wants to identify which business unit owns each Azure resource, so the monthly costs can be reported by department. Which feature should they use? Tags, resource locks, Azure Monitor, or availability zones? The answer is obviously tags. The clue is identify which business unit owns each resource, right? And report costs by department. Now, let's take a step back and connect these governance tools together in a real-world scenario. Imagine a company is expanding its Azure environment. At first, the cloud environment is small, a few VMs, storage account, maybe a web app. Governance doesn't seem urgent, but 6 months later, multiple teams are deploying resources. Right, developers, they're building test environments. Project teams are launching applications. Finance is asking why costs are increasing so much. Let's not forget security. They're asking whether the resources meet compliance standards. And operations is asking who actually owns what resource. That's exactly where governance becomes really important. The organization could use management groups to apply governance across multiple subscriptions, right? Could use Azure policy to enforce approved regions and required tags. It'll use tags to track ownership and cost centers. It could use resource locks, right, to protect critical production resources as well. And then you can also use cost management to monitor spending. This is the story Microsoft wants you to understand. Governance is not one tool. Governance is a way of managing Azure at scale. Now let's move into talking about cost management. This is another section where Microsoft gives away marks if you understand the purpose of each tool. The cloud gives organizations flexibility, but flexibility can be very dangerous if nobody's watching the cost. In an on-premises environment, spending tends to happen up front. You buy servers, you buy storage, you buy networking equipment. Once the hardware is purchased, the cost is visible and predictable in a bit of a different way. In Azure, resources can be created quickly. That's really powerful, but it also means costs can grow quickly as well. If a virtual machine is left running, you may continue paying for it. If storage grows rapidly, costs can increase. And if data is moved between services or regions, networking costs can apply. If larger compute sizes are selected, the bill changes massively. So, Microsoft wants AZ-900 candidates to understand cost management at a foundational level. Microsoft Learn's cost management module covers factors that affect Azure costs, the Azure pricing calculator, Microsoft cost management tags, which we spoke about, and optimization options, including reservations, savings plans, and spot pricing. Let's begin with the most basic idea, okay? Azure costs are affected by several factors. The type of resource matters. A small virtual machine will not cost the same as a large virtual machine, right? A basic storage configuration will not cost the same as high-performance storage configurations. A service running continuously will actually cost, more than something used occasionally. The region can also affect cost. Azure services may have different prices in different regions. The amount of usage also matters, right? This is a consumption model again. The more you consume, the more you may pay. Support plans, licensing, redundancy options, and data transfers can also influence cost. For the AZ-900, you don't need to memorize exact prices. In fact, you shouldn't even try. Prices change all the time. The exam's not testing whether you know the monthly cost of a specific VM size. It is testing whether you know which tool to use and what factors influence cost. First tool you need to know is the Azure pricing calculator. This is used before deployment, right? And that phrase actually matters as well because this may trick you in the exam. Before deployment is key. Microsoft Learn explains that the Azure pricing calculator helps turn anticipated usage into an estimated cost. And that makes it easy to plan and budget for Azure usage. If a company is planning to deploy a new solution and wants to estimate the monthly cost, use the Azure pricing calculator. Imagine a business is planning to host a web application in Azure. They expect to use app service, a database, storage, and networking. Before deploying anything though, they want an estimate, right? That's exactly what the pricing calculator is for. Here's the exam pattern, right? If the question says estimate cost before deployment, that's where you choose the Azure pricing calculator. Let's do a knowledge check. Okay. A company is planning a new Azure deployment and they want to estimate the expected monthly cost before creating any resources. Which tool should they use? Should they use the Azure pricing calculator, Microsoft cost management, or maybe Azure Monitor, or should they use the Azure Health Service? The answer is the Azure pricing calculator. The clue is before creating any resources, right? Now let's compare that with Microsoft Cost Management. Okay, cost management is used after resources exist, right? And it helps organizations monitor, analyze, and optimize actual cloud spending. This is where you look at what you are actually currently spending. You can review costs, you can analyze trends, you can understand which resources are actually contributing to your bill. You can use budgets and alerts to help manage spending. Microsoft Learn's AZ-900 cost management module includes Microsoft Cost Management as part of estimating, tracking, and managing Azure costs. That exam distinction is simple. Pricing calculates for estimating before deployment, cost management is for tracking and managing costs afterwards, right? Let's do another knowledge check and test that. Company already has Azure resources deployed, right? Finance team wants to review actual spending and identify where costs are coming from. Which tool should they use? Azure Pricing Calculator, Microsoft Cost Management, Azure Policy, or Resource Logs? The answer is Microsoft Cost Management. Again, let's look for the clue in the question, right? Already has Azure resources deployed and review actual spending. Now we also need to talk about the total cost of ownership calculator as well. This is usually called TCO calculator. This tool is about comparison, right? Specifically comparing the cost of running workloads on premises with the cost of running them in Azure. If an organization is trying to build a business case for migration, the TCO calculator is a strong fit. The pricing calculator estimates Azure service costs. The TCO calculator compares current on-premises costs with Azure. That distinction is, very exam friendly. Microsoft says we need to estimate the cost of a planned Azure deployment. Think pricing calculator. If Microsoft says we need to compare our existing data center costs with moving to Azure, think TCO calculator. Now let's talk about cost optimization. Okay, Microsoft Learn's cost management module again explicitly includes optimization options such as reservations, savings plans, and spot pricing. For AZ-900, you need to understand the broad purpose. Okay, reservations are useful when an organization can commit to using certain resources for a long period of time. The idea is that predictable workloads may benefit from commitment-based pricing. If you know you're going to run a workload consistently, reserve capacity may reduce costs compared with the pure pay-as-you-go. Savings plans are also related to committed usage as well. Spot pricing is a bit different. Spot pricing can allow organizations to use unused Azure capacity, but it's generally suitable for workloads that can tolerate interruption. At a fundamental level, think of spot pricing as a cost optimization option for interruptible workloads. Don't overcomplicate it. If the workload must run continuously and cannot be interrupted, spot, is probably not the right answer. If the workload is batch processing, testing, or something that can stop and restart, spot pricing will be a good fit. Now let's connect cost management back to governance. Tags help cost reporting, right? Azure Policy can enforce tagging requirements. Microsoft Cost Management can analyze spend. Azure Advisor can also recommend cost improvements. These tools all work together. That is the real Azure story. Organizations don't just deploy cloud services and hope for the best, they estimate before deployment. They monitor after deployment, they optimize over time, and they enforce standards through governance. This is exactly what Microsoft is testing you for. Now, let's talk about the tools used to manage and deploy Azure resources. This section is important because Microsoft doesn't only expect you to know Azure services, it also expects you to know the different ways resources can actually be managed. Microsoft Learn's Management and Governance Learning Path includes a module on features and tools for managing and deploying Azure resources, covering tools for managing Azure and on-premises resources. The first tool is the Azure portal. This is a browser-based graphical interface, right? And if you're new to Azure, the portal is usually the easiest place to start. You can create resources, you can view settings, check costs, monitor resources, configure networking as well, assign permissions, and review recommendations. For the AZ-900, the portal is generally associated with visual browser-based management. Then we have Azure PowerShell. This is used to manage Azure using PowerShell commands. This is useful for automation, scripting, and repeatable administration. If an organization already uses PowerShell heavily, Azure PowerShell may be a natural choice. Then we have the Azure CLI. This is another command line tool, right? And it can be used across platforms. It's commonly used for scripting and automation. For AZ-900, don't worry about memorizing commands, just understand the purpose. Portal equals graphical interface, PowerShell and CLI equal command line management and automation. Then there is Azure Cloud Shell. And again, this is a browser-based, it's browser-based, but it's a command line access directly into Azure, basically. The key idea is that it allows command line management from within the browser. Again, no deep configuration required, just recognize its purpose. Now let's talk about Azure Resource Manager. This one really matters, right? Because often it's shortened to ARM normally. And this is a deployment and management service for Azure. You create, update or delete resources, right? Azure Resource Manager is involved in managing those operations. At the fundamental level, you should understand that ARM or Azure Resource Manager provides a consistent management layer. It helps organize and deploy resources. It also supports templates. ARM templates again allow infrastructure to be defined as code. For the AZ-900, the phrase infrastructure as code does matter, right? And it means defining infrastructure in files or templates so it can deploy consistently and repeatedly. So why does it actually matter, right? Because manual deployments can introduce inconsistency, right? One administrator may configure resources one way, another administrator may configure them differently. A template allows the organization to standardize deployments. Now, you may also see references to Bicep in broader Azure learning. Bicep is a language used for deploying Azure resources declaratively. At the AZ-900 level, do not go too deep in this. Just remember that templates and infrastructure as code help automate and standardize deployments. The exam may frame this as a business requirement. Let's give me a practical example, right? A company wants to deploy the same environment repeatedly across deployment, test, and production. Which approach helps? Infrastructure as code, right? A company wants to reduce manual configuration mistakes. Which approach helps? Templates or scripted deployment. A company wants repeatable deployments. Again, this is infrastructure as code. Do a knowledge check, okay? A company wants to deploy the same Azure environment consistently across subscriptions and reduce manual configuration errors. Which concept best fits this requirement? So we have infrastructure as code, availability zones, Azure Health Service, or resource logs. The answer is infrastructure as code. Consistency and repeatability are the clues in that question. Now, let's move on to talking about monitoring. Monitoring is one of those areas candidates often rush through. Don't do that. Monitoring tools are easy marks if you understand their different purposes. Microsoft Learn's monitoring module for AZ-900 covers Azure Advisor, Azure Service Health, Azure Monitor, Log Analytics, monitoring alerts, and application insights. Let's begin with Azure Monitor. This is the broad monitoring platform, right? Whenever Microsoft talks about collecting metrics, logs, alerts, or telemetry, Azure Monitor should come to mind. If you want visibility into Azure Resource Performance, Azure Monitor is central, right? If you want alerts when something crosses a threshold, again, Azure Monitor is relevant. If you want to collect logs and metrics across Azure resources, Azure Monitor is the service to recognize. For AZ-900, the pattern is simple. Metrics, logs, alerts, monitoring, telemetry equals Azure Monitor. Right, let's do a knowledge check. A company wants to collect metrics from Azure resources and generate alerts when performance thresholds are exceeded. Which service should it use? Azure Monitor, Azure Policy, Azure Pricing Calculator, or Resource Logs? The answer is Azure Monitor. The clues to look for here are metrics and alerts. Now, let's talk about Log Analytics. Log Analytics is used with Azure Monitor to query and analyze log data. For AZ-900, you don't need to write queries, right? You just need to understand that Log Analytics is part of the monitoring story for analyzing logs, right? Then there's Application Insights. This is mainly associated with monitoring applications, right? If Microsoft talks about application performance, application availability, or understanding how an application is behaving, application insights may be relevant. At the fundamental level, keep the distinction simple. Azure Monitor is the broad monitoring platform. Log Analytics helps analyze logs. Application Insights helps monitor application behavior. Now let's move to Azure Health Service. This is where candidates often confuse Service Health with Azure Monitor. Obviously, Azure Monitor is about your resources and telemetry. Azure Service Health is about Azure Service issues that may affect you. Microsoft Learn describes Azure Service Health advisories as notifications about important but not critical issues that could affect Azure resources, including service retirements, configuration issues, and upgrade requirements. Think about it this way. If your virtual machine is using high CPU, that is something you monitor with Azure Monitor. If Microsoft Azure has a service incident affecting a region you use, that's where Azure Service Health becomes relevant. Service Health provides personalized information about Azure service issues, maintenance and advisories that might affect your subscription, services or regions. So the exam pattern is, if the issue is with your resource performance, think Azure Monitor. If the issue is with Azure Platform Health or service incidents, think Azure Service Health. Let's do a knowledge check. A company wants to know whether an Azure service issue is affecting the specific regions and services used by a subscription. Which tool should it use? Azure Health Service, the Azure Pricing Calculator, Azure Policy or Tags? The answer is Azure Service Health, right? And the clue is Azure Service Issue affecting services and regions, right? That's what to look out for in that type of question. Now let's talk about Azure Advisor. I think I mentioned this in the last section. This is another one of those services that appears simple, but it's very exam friendly. Azure Advisor provides recommendations. Simple, that is the key word, recommendations. Microsoft Learn's monitoring module includes Azure Advisor as one of the monitoring tools candidates should understand. At a high level, it analyzes your Azure environment and provides recommendations to help improve things like cost, security, reliability, performance, and operation excellence. For the exam, focus on this phrase, personalized recommendations. If Microsoft says a company wants recommendations to improve Azure resources, Azure Advisor is often the answer. If the company wants optimization recommendations, Azure Advisor may be relevant. Maybe a company wants general best practice recommendations. Again, Azure Advisor is relevant. But don't confuse Advisor with policy. Azure Policy again enforces those rules. Azure Advisor recommends improvements. That distinction matters. Azure Policy says you must follow this standard. Azure Advisor says, here's a recommendation to improve your environment. Let's do a knowledge check. So a company wants personalized recommendations to improve the cost, performance and reliability of its Azure environment. Which service should it use? Azure Advisor, Azure Policy, Resource Logs or Microsoft Entra ID? The answer is Azure Advisor. The key phrase is personalized recommendations. Now let's connect all of the monitoring tools together, right? Imagine a company has an application running in Azure. Azure Monitor can collect metrics and logs from the resources. Application Insights can help monitor the application experience. Log Analytics can help analyze log data. Azure Health Service can notify the company of Azure platform issues affecting relevant services and regions. Azure Advisor can provide recommendations to improve the environment. Again, Microsoft isn't testing deep implementation, it's testing whether you know which tool solves which problem. Now let me give you the patterns you should remember for this part of the exam, right? When Microsoft says estimate cost before deployment, think Azure Pricing Calculator. When Microsoft says track actual spending, think Microsoft Cost Management, right? If they say compare on-premises costs with Azure, this is where you need to think about the TCO calculator. If you see the phrase organize resources for reporting, this is where you need to think about tags. They might say enforcing standards, this is where Azure Policy comes in. And when you see prevent accidental deletion, think resource logs. If you see managing permissions, this is where you need to think about role-based access control RBAC. If Microsoft says collecting metrics, logs and alerts, we know that's Azure Monitor. When Microsoft says something like platform outage or service incident, this is Azure Service Health. And if you see recommendations for improvement, think Azure Advisor. This section is not about memorizing random product names, right? It's about mapping business requirements to the correct Azure tool. That's the whole exam. Microsoft describes a business requirement, you identify the concept. Let's do a combined scenario now, okay? A company has several Azure subscriptions, right? The finance team wants sort of monthly cost reporting by department. The security team wants resources restricted to approved regions. The operations team wants alerts when the VMs use too much CPU. The cloud team wants recommendations to reduce sort of unnecessary spend. Which tools actually apply in this scenario? For monthly cost reporting by department, we can use tags and cost management, right? For restricting regions, we can use Azure Policy. For the alerts on CPU usage requirement, this is where Azure Monitor comes in. And for the recommendations to reduce spend, we go to Azure Advisor. That's exactly how Microsoft builds questions. Different requirements, different tools. Don't choose a tool that sounds most familiar. Choose a tool that matches the requirement. Coming towards the end now, but before we finish, I want to talk about study resources. Okay, for the AZ-900, your primary source should be Microsoft Learn. not random notes, not outdated screenshots, not old dumps. The official AZ-900 certification page describes the certification as demonstrating foundational knowledge of cloud concepts, core Azure services, and Azure and governance features and tools. Everything that we've gone through in the last 3 episodes. Microsoft Learn also provides the official learning paths for cloud concepts, right? Azure Architecture and Services and Azure Management and Governance. The official study guide explains that candidates should be able to describe Azure architectural components and services such as compute, networking and storage, and also describe features and tools to secure, govern and administer Azure. That means your study should follow the same structure. First, understand cloud concepts. Second, understand Azure architecture and core services. Third, understand security, governance, cost management monitoring. Then, use a Microsoft Practice Assessment. The certification page also describes the free practice assessment as a way to assess readiness, understand the style, wording and difficulty of likely exam questions, and identify areas where most preparation is needed. That's important because AZ-900 is not just about knowing definitions, it's about recognising Microsoft's question style. So when you practice, don't just ask whether you got the right answer, ask why the incorrect answers were wrong. That's where real learning actually happens. If the answer is Azure Policy, why is it not RBAC? Right? If the answer is Azure Monitor, why is it not Service Health? If the answer is Pricing Calculator, why is it not Cost Management? That habit will make you much stronger in the exam. So let's bring everything together, right? AZ-900 is not asking you to become an Azure architect. It's not asking you to configure enterprise networking from memory. It's not even asking you to write scripts, deploy production workloads, or troubleshoot complex outages. What it is asking is whether you understand Azure at a foundational level. Do you understand why? Do you understand why organizations use cloud computing? Do you understand the difference between IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS? Do you understand regions, availability zones, resource groups, subscriptions, and management groups? Do you actually recognize core Azure services across compute, networking, and storage? Do you understand and identify, security concepts such as Microsoft Entra ID, authentication, authorization, RBAC, MFA, conditional access, and zero trust? Do you understand governance tools such as Azure Policy, resource locks and tags? Not to mention costing tools such as Pricing Calculator, TCO Calculator, and the cost management. Do you understand monitoring tools such as Azure Monitor, Service Health, and Azure Advisor? If you can answer those questions confidently, you are in a very, very strong position. The real key to passing this AZ-900 is pattern recognition, right? When Microsoft says private connection, you think Express Room. When Microsoft says event-driven code, you think Azure Functions. When they say web application without server management, this is where you think about app service. They might say things like enforce standards, Azure Policy, right? When Microsoft says prevent accidental deletion, this is where you think about resource locks. For a phrase like estimate before deployment, this is where you think about Pricing Calculator. If they say things like monitor logs and metrics, we know that's Azure Monitor, right? And when they say service issue affecting Azure, we know straight away that's going to be Azure Health Service, right? And then words like recommendations, that's going to be Azure Advisor. This is how you pass the exam efficiently. If this Cram session helped you, make sure you subscribe because I'm building more Microsoft certification Cram sessions, practice questions, study plans and exam strategy videos to help you pass faster without wasting time on content you don't need, right? And drop me a comment in the video with what exam topics you'd like me to do a Cram video on next. Good luck for your AZ-900 exam and I'll see you in the next certification Cram session.